issue is not directly relevant to the research project that sort of got me through a tenure track and all of that. But the image also suggests, and I'll be able to sort of save a little bit of time by skipping over the first few slides. By now, I think it's clear to everybody the outsized influence that learning from Las Vegas, Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, Stephen Eisenhower had on 2 or perhaps 3 generations of those of us who are trained as architects. Specifically for me, I wanted to just sort of pay homage to the fact that the work, as those of us that studied it or sort of were within its thrall, the expansion that it represented in terms of our appreciation and our evaluation for the built environment beyond the works of architecture and sort of traditional notions of public space. By the way, I just discovered in sort of fetching this slide, this is the original Glassine book cover from the 1972 edition. MIT Press later this month is coming out with a facsimile edition of this book. For anyone who's sort of lusted after the 1972 edition, we'll get some sort of a facsimile. So, again, so this is a story about a sign in the town that I grew up in, Toronto. It's a story about the significance of the store as well and the man who ran it, Sam Snyderman, there on the left. And my partial role in ensuring that the sign was preserved, and the larger sort of issue in a city whose track record with preservation, historical preservation, is pretty inadequate. I'm a big fan of the city. You've probably heard some good press about the city. But in terms of architectural and sort of general preservation, it leaves a lot to be desired. And so when I first started out in this campaign, ad hoc campaign, you know, I as you might expect, I turned to some of my mentors, my instructors from when I was a student. All of them said, give up. This is hopeless. Toronto is going to, you know, it's terrible for preservation. You'll be wasting your time. You should focus on your research agenda. You haven't gotten tenure yet. And nevertheless, I persisted out of a kind of personal love for this store and for this sign. Very quickly, and I'll have to sort of go through these images very, very quickly in order to avoid the wrath of Olivia here. The record store itself has its origins in the 1930s, but moves to Yonge Street, the main commercial strip in Toronto, in 1961. These images are from the original iteration of the sign at 347 Yonge Street. Snyderman moved the store to Yonge Street as close as he could to A&A Records, which we'll see in a couple of images here, which at the time was the largest record store in Canada. And Snyderman had ambitions to sort of take that position. You can see the proximity of the two stores here, circa 1968, prior to the installation of the sign that I'll be talking about today. One of the issues that Snyderman faced was that although the two signs sort of vied for attention during the day, it was at night that A&A Records, really sort of outshone, literally and figuratively, Sam's sign. So in 1971, he went to a kind of interesting firm. They were sign builders, but also advertising men, Sam and Jack Markle. Really sort of interesting new thinking in terms of the city. Although initially Snyderman had approached them to sort of make some minor adjustments to the sign, they came back to him with this radical reworking of the storefront, and was approved and installed in 1971. And I place the date is significant, I suggest, because, you know, in the period of learning from Las Vegas, not leaving Las Vegas, 1968 was the original studio at Yale University. The book, the first edition, comes out in 1972, and so this sign comes along really sort of within the thick of those things. And it's a little reductive to imagine that the Markle brothers were thinking of very specific influences. Pop art was sort of very much in the air, but I know from personal conversations that Frank Stella, who was represented by a local gallery owner by the name of David Mirvish, Stella himself was based in New York, but had a great champion in Mirvish in Toronto. And so in the small circle of sort of people that included Snyderman and the Markle brothers, Stella loomed very large. And of course, Stella was very open about suggesting that one of his primary influences was the work of Jasper Johns. And so again, I don't need to sort of narrow it down or to be overly targeted to extend the metaphor. But obviously also in the signs of what the sign said and what it showed, this was a record store. Yes, of course, why not put a giant spinning vinyl record on top? We can see here in the original context then, between 1971 and about 1977, here, 76, excuse me, when A&A Records responded in time by sort of updating their very sort of characteristic 1950s, 1960s collage of neon sort of portions, and responded to the sort of singularity of the Sam the Record Man sign with a sign of their own. This is the state of the streetscape in about the mid-70s. We see the impact here at night. And already by the late 70s, it had the sort of iconic status. Yonge Street was the primary commercial strip. It took on a kind of life of its own and became a kind of symbol for the city of its time. These are screenshots from a documentary that the classical pianist Glenn Gould, who lived in Toronto and in this instance was describing his experience of his hometown, very prominently sort of drives past the signs on several occasions throughout the hour-long documentary. That gives a sense of what things look like in '79. This image I show from 1980 because this is really where I entered the picture as a high school kid who's working nights as an usher at Massey Hall, which is a few blocks away. And the sort of aura that the street had for us, literally and figuratively, is a sort of place to go down and hang out. And although this is a black and white image, the sort of overexposure gives a sense of the ambient glow of the intense sort of spillover of light from all of these signs, and made it an incredibly exciting place to be, especially as a sort of 16-year-old. In 1987, Sam bought the store next between the original A&A and the original Sam's, and I guess somewhat logically decided to add a second disc. And it's in this form, the double discs, that the sign really achieved its iconic status. We see a sense of what that's like. Ideally, I'd show some video to sort of get a sense of the spinning effect. And by 1991, he'd bought the adjacent building to the right and added some additional ones. And this sign, the spinning disc, becomes a sort of icon for the business throughout the 90s. It grows beyond its original location into a chain of about 140 stores. And the sign itself, the storefront, becomes the kind of icon for all the suburban, wow, okay. So I'm not even going that fast. So what happens? Well, Sam's falls victim to MP3s and downloading and the internet and so forth, and so the chain falls apart and declares bankruptcy in 2001. The main store managed to stay open through 2007, when the property is sold by Snyderman to Ryerson University, which has long sort of aimed, it's a downtown campus, and was aiming to get some direct access to Yonge Street, and so bought the property and was allowed to do so and allowed to demolish the store, which had become iconic. It was the largest record store in the world at one point, in exchange for preserving the signs. And so we see here, this is Sheldon Levy, who's the president of Ryerson University, present at the deinstallation of the sign, or demolition, depending on your point of view. He's rolling out some of the neon tubing. This is in 2007. The promise is that Ryerson will reinstall these signs on a new building that they are planning for this site, a student learning center. Fast forward to 2013. Yeah. Not a lot happens. What happens in the meantime? Snyderman dies in 2012. A few months later, some images of the proposed building are leaked. This is by the fabulous firm Snowhetta. This is a rendering of the project. It looks pretty much like that now that it's been completed. The renderings make it clear that Ryerson and Levy have no intention of reinstalling the signs on this building. The building has obviously been designed without that sort of fate in mind. The press gets wind of it. Labor Day 2013. I hear about this while I'm sort of on my way to fly to Toronto for Labor Day weekend. The news that Ryerson is going to attempt to sort of renege on their deal, it makes me so upset that I wake up in the middle of the night and I launch this Facebook page at 3 in the morning. And this is, I just scroll, for the purposes of this presentation, I just scroll all the way back 4 years to the initial posts. What does this have to do with saving sign? Well, I thought in the hours between sort of doing this and figuring out what would do and knowing that this would be a futile attempt, launched this and did everything I could using social media, having sort of been told that this would be the way to sort of gain momentum. Formed a committee as a result of people who became aware of it, wrote old school letters to the editor. These are some letters. I got tenure around this time, but getting my letter printed as the lead letter in the Toronto Star was probably more exciting to me as a hometown kid than actually getting tenure. We thought that we had had a breakthrough when through lobbying the various city officials, we actually got the ear of the mayor at the time, Rob Ford, probably the most famous Torontonian who ever lived, unfortunately, and one of his friends here who's a big fan. He voiced support for saving signs. Unfortunately, about a week after he made that, the famous crack smoking video came out, and so anything he was for really did not carry as much weight. There he is, our dear former leader. So the fate of the sign was very much in doubt. What happened? How did it come? How does the story have a happy ending? Well, as it turns out, it really goes back to Snyderman. Snyderman was not only a businessman, but he was a tireless promoter of Canadian musical talent back in the 60s when no one else was doing this, back where there was really no sort of Canadian music industry to speak of. And we can see this image here is quite telling. If you're Canadian, you would recognize all of the albums that were placed at the front of the store were Canadian acts. Some of them may be familiar to you. So what happened was that we were able to get iconic Canadian musicians to write letters on behalf of the sign. You can see here Snyderman in his younger days sort of with many of the musicians that he promoted. We started to get letters from these guys. The very first was Gordon Lightfoot. Some of you may know who Gordon Lightfoot is. He was that famous outside of Anne Murray. We got about 30 letters in all. These are the ones that I thought that you might recognize. Those of you that are older than me and those of you that are younger than me. Gord Downie, who is today probably the most famous pop star in Canada, wrote a really beautiful letter. Surprisingly, the one that really tipped the balance was one from Geddy Lee of Rush. Does anyone know Rush, the band? Yeah. It got dramatically more hits than any other letter we put on it. It made it on the television news. Sort of an enduring sign of the influence of Rush in Canada. That changed the balance. We had a level of interest by the press, both traditional and online, and the petition and so forth, and that really changed things. Here, I'm going to just sort of skip to the signs will be reinstalled. According to the original schedule, I thought that it would have been finished about 2 weeks ago, and so when I was planning to do this, I thought that I would end up by showing you the actual installation and the ribbon cutting ceremony. That's going to happen next month. But this is where it's going. Dundas Square is a sort of Times Square. It emerges as the sort of Times Square of Toronto. And they will be reinstalled. They have the preservation is completed. Now they're erecting the superstructure on the top of this building that will allow it to be preserved. In the end, what the greater significance was that we were really a part of a conversation changer in the city that began to really recognize not just the sort of architectural and the preservation and value of the signs, but enhancing and enlarging the larger conversation about preservation in the city. And there have been all kinds of signs about what this has done, and it's been remarked by the media as well that there's really been a change of tone in terms of preservation. And so this has been very exciting. We've seen this in various forms. These are local artists who are now sort of using the signs as a kind of symbol for the city. These are sort of concert posters and so forth. They're now T-shirts. If you're really cool, you wear one of these. So lessons learned. Social media does work. It can work. I don't have time to sort of go into suggestions and strategies, but if anybody's sort of potentially interested in getting involved in a campaign like this, I'd be happy to do it. Finally, what I learned also is that what motivated this sentiment, what motivated the movement, was really based on things that I was told would discount the validity of the preservation itself. Nostalgia, personal memories, and so forth. This is an image that sort of sums that up for me. This is Snyderman in the classical music area of the store, the largest area, the area where he hung out. About once a month during my childhood, my dad would drag me to the store, and he would have long conversations with Snyderman about, Chopin or something. And I thought, this is a colossal waste of time. As it turns out, it wasn't. It bears sort of directly on my involvement in the campaign, and as I say, it has sparked a kind of sea change in the way that people think about signage and about preservation in general in the city of Toronto and Canada as a result. So I'm sorry for going over, Olivia. I'm sorry I tried. Okay, done.
Thank you.
Thank you.